Welcome to our Pastor's Corner teaching series. In this teaching series, we have been journeying through the books of the minor prophets. I think a part of the Bible that many of us may not be too familiar with. And we actually now are in our last video for this series. We are in the book of Malachi, the last book of the prophets and the last book of the Old Testament. So we're going to look at this book today. And so I'm going to invite you here to pause this video, take a moment to read through the book of Malachi, and then resume with us right after this. Well, let me just give us some backdrop to understanding this book, and then we're going to get into this book as well. The name Malachi is really the name my messenger. And with that, I think there's this twofold thing. Malachi is not only God's messenger during this time, but he's also pointing to a future messenger, the future Messiah, who will come and give God's full and complete message as well. During this book, you can also have your finger placed in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and kind of read what's going on there in parallel with this book as well. So this is about 100 years after Israel has returned from exile. When they returned, there was so much hope and anticipation as they were rebuilding the city, they were rebuilding the temple, and they were hoping that Messiah was going to come, and then they were going to rebuild the kingdom of David and the kingdom of God to its former glory. And so they were hoping at some point that the Messiah was going to come and reestablish the kingdom. So they returned with all this great hope, but the problem was then, as they started to do all this, they were met with adversity from their own people, and some of the lessons that they were supposed to learn with regards to justice and violence and oppression, they didn't learn those lessons while they were in exile. In fact, a new generation of people again, would just begin the cycle of corruption all over again. And so this book is set up as a series of arguments. It's kind of like a dispute or an argument between two parties. God is actually going to say something. The people of Israel are going to fight back by saying something, and then God will have the final word on that something. And so God will make a claim, Israel would respond, and in fact, God would then have the last word. It kind of became almost commonplace after this in many of the rabbinic teachings that this is how they would do this teaching discourse would be, here's the word, here's the fight back, and here's the final word on it. And so it become interesting historically as part of that. So what we have are six dialogues that God will say something, Israel would respond, and then God would have the final word on it. So we're going to explore all of these as we look through this book. So the first is that God is going to expose Israel's corruption again, and he's going to just point out, look, you didn't really learn your lesson in exile. So if you have your Bible, in Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 to 5, it says there, God says, I love you. In verse 2, I love you. And Israel responds with such a harsh way to respond. They say, how? How have you loved us? How have you shown us love? And then God describes it for them. He says, I've given grace to Jacob and over top of Esau. And in fact, you are experiencing that grace because you continue to exist. Jacob's line is you guys today, whereas Esau's line, the Edomites, they have been destroyed. And so you can read about that in Genesis 25 to 27 in the book of Obadiah. So he says, I loved you. They say, how? He says, well, look, you're still here. I promised to Jacob. My promise to him continues even to you being here. So then in Malachi chapter 1, verses 6 to 7, what you have there is then God saying, hey, you Israelites, you guys are defiling the temple and you're showing utter contempt for me by the way you are doing things. And they say, how? They push back again to God. How are we doing such a thing? And so in verses 8 to 11, we have God saying, well, you're giving me these lame offerings. And by doing so, you're showing me you do not value and you do not honor who I am. And it's not just you, the people, it's also the priests, the ones who were supposed to keep the integrity of the temple and keep the integrity of the sacrifices. They were tolerating these lame offerings, and they were also participating in giving these lame offerings. And so God was really coming down on them. In verses 12 to 14, he was really coming down on them with what is called half-hearted worship, this fake worship, this the going through the motions type of worship. And so as Israel responds to him, he goes back and he says, all of this will not go unanswered. And so in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, God gives a description of how he will not tolerate half-hearted worship. He will not tolerate the way they are giving their offerings. He will not tolerate how we today even approach God. Just to think about it in our own ways, how we sometimes go into church half-hearted and go into giving God half-heartedly or lame things as well. In Malachi chapter 2, verses 10 to 16, then God brings up another thing. He talks and complains about the very fact that you Israelites, you're cheating on me. And not only are you cheating on me, many of the men, you are cheating also on your wives. And of course, Israel fights back and says, how are we doing such a thing? And God is saying, well, here's what you're doing. You're marrying all these godless women that are around you. And not only are you marrying these godless women, you're divorcing the women that you already have for no good reason at all. And so when you're marrying these godless women, you're adopting their practices of godless worships as well. And so in Nehemiah chapter 13, you can read more about that in detail. And what God is saying is this is a betrayal of the covenant that we have. This is the betrayal of what we set out, that I would be your God and you would be my people. You would worship me. I am the one true God. And so this is the indictment that he's giving on them and just saying, hey, listen, this is what you're doing wrong. I just can't believe that as we continue to look at this, when God brings up something, it's sometimes hard to imagine how we fight back, isn't it? Like God exposes things in our own lives, and oftentimes we too are like Israel. We're just so stubborn and so stiff-necked, and we fight back and say, God, how are we doing that, right? So maybe it's something for us to examine in our own internal heart and our own heart attitudes towards God as well. In chapter 3, we then have a switching a bit. God is going to confront Israel's corruption. He's not going to tolerate this anymore. So in Malachi chapter 2, verses 17 to chapter 3, verse 5, the people actually ask God this question. In verse 17, they ask God, where is justice? Where is the justice that you God, you're a just God. Where is this justice? Because here's what's happening, God. We see all around us, all the people who are wicked and evil, they seem to thrive. And God, you don't do anything about it. They seem to thrive and you don't do anything about it. And so God says to them in Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 and 3, it says, a messenger will come. He will bring justice. He will purify with fire to the point that only the faithful will remain. And so God said, I'm going to bring someone. And it's this indication of the messenger, the Messiah, the one who is to come, who will come and bring God's full judgment and justice. He will not only bring that, he will cleanse the people. They can't do it on their own. He will cleanse them with fire. And at the end, only the faithful will remain as a result. Malachi chapter 3, verses 6 to 12, God now brings up again, what is with the inconsistency of your worship? What is with the inconsistency of your faith in verse 8? And then Israel says, well, how are we being inconsistent? And so in verse 10, he brings up the very fact that you're not being consistent with what you're giving, with the way you're giving. So he says, bring your tithe, your 1/10 of your income, which was, again, back in Leviticus chapter 27, was what was instituted. Just bring 1/10 of what you had, whether it was your income, so it was grains or whatever it was. But here you are neglecting that simple responsibility. And so God is challenging them, saying, you're being inconsistent. You're not doing what the laws had set out to do. You're not doing what you said you would set out to do. And you are neglecting your responsibility to the temple as well. And then in Malachi chapter 3, verses 13 to 18, the people were responding to God, it's pointless. It's pointless to serve God. Why bother? Why bother serving God? Why bother doing any of this stuff? Because again, God, when we do it, all we see is rules and regulations, and yet at the same time we do this, but it seems like those people over there who don't fear you, who don't love you, they get away with everything. And they, in fact, not only do they get away with it, they seem to prosper. And so they point that out, and God responds with a story. God responds with this narrative story about a faithful remnant of people who will walk and honor God, and their names will be written on this scroll of remembrance. And the whole point of that story is to inspire them to live not for today, but for the future. Not just, what you see today, because God will make this right, but it's not going to happen today. You have to wait. So don't look at what's going on around you. Anticipate what God will do. I am a God of justice. I will make wrongs right. And so here's the challenge that I think with that is that a lot of times I find that even as Christians, we struggle with this. notion. And I think this goes to the very fact that we don't value God and we don't value our faith as much as we should. Oftentimes we see, how come other people get to enjoy Sunday off? They get to go do whatever they want to do, go watch football, they go play in the park, and here we are at church. And I've heard Christians complain about that. And it's like, take this story of Malachi here and the people grumbling to God, why bother serving you? Why bother going to church? Why bother giving to you? Why bother any of this stuff? And God says, you know what? You just don't get it. You don't know who I am really at the end of the day. You don't value me the way you really should. And in fact, that would be a detriment to you, not to me. God would be saying that. Really, if we choose to follow him, we choose to follow him. We follow him wholeheartedly, and we have a lot of faith and trust that God is doing things. And so there may be temporary things that we don't understand why it seems to maybe your non-believing coworker gets to have more fun in life. But really, at the end of the day, do we not understand and value God and for who he is and what he has done? Chapter 4 gives us this other picture of this faithful remnant. Chapter 4 gives us this picture of God's faithful remnant, and it says there in verse 2, but for you who revere my name, the Sun of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like a well-fed calf. There will come a day where all wickedness will be gone, all things like that will be gone. And this day of the Lord that's going to come is not going to be one of dread, but one of great joy. And if you just remain faithful, just the calling to remain faithful. The whole story concludes with this. In verses 4 to the end, it says this, remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. This one last phrase here gives us a very interesting setup to think about. He reminds them to listen and obey the laws of Moses, to remember the laws of Moses, and to remember the prophets even. And he uses Elijah as the main one there. And it's just this reminder that here's the end of the Old Testament. Here's the end of it here. Here's the end of the stories of the minor prophets, but here's the end of the entire Old Testament that we have. And it's to say, don't give up on what has happened before in this story. Don't give up on what God has brought about with Moses, all the way even down to this point here to the prophets. And again, it's all to summarize this, is that Israel, you will be redeemed. You will come together and you will be honored and redeemed. And through your line, someone will come. And this messenger that is found in chapter 3, verse 1 is the one who will come and fulfill everything that God is promising. There's a future time. God will send a new Moses, a new Elijah, and restore God's people, and he will change their hearts. See, all those rules, you can't live up to them. You won't be able to follow them. So outside of yourself, you're going to need someone, and he's going to send Jesus Christ. And after this, there will be this period of silence. And as the people wait in silence, wondering when it's going to happen, how is it going to happen, there were revolutions, there were revolts, and there was new world powers coming into play. And in this period of silence, again, they were waiting for someone who would fulfill all of this. And see, the problem is that the exile didn't change their stubborn ways. And so they were going to need someone outside of themselves to save them. And this is where Jesus would come on the scene. And this is where then the Holy Spirit would come and impact even our lives to today, where we don't fully rely on ourselves to follow the rules. We've been given freedom because Christ himself is the fulfillment of all of that, of the entire Old Testament, of all the prophets as well. And so this is how the book of Malachi comes together and even transitions us to get us ready for the story of Jesus in the New Testament. So that's it. That's been our journey through the books of the minor prophets. We hope that it's been something of value to you as we explored various parts of this book that maybe, various parts of the Bible that maybe we're not familiar with. Our hope here is, again, that we would use this as something to deepen our own spiritual journey as we reflect on who God is, his character, what he has done, and even impact how we live our lives faithfully to him. So at this point, since we're done this series on the minor prophets, again, thank you for joining us in this series. We're going to take a pause on this Pastor's Corner teaching series for a few weeks, just so we can gear up to get our next series of teachings ready. So with that, stay tuned for when we'll do that. We'll keep you informed as to when that's going to happen, probably in a few weeks from now, probably at the beginning of March, actually. So until then, love and peace. We'll see you again at our Pastor's Corner teaching series.